What's going on, everybody? It's YCS coming at you with a brand new video, and happy Halloween to those watching this on the day it releases. I'm pretty sure it's going to be going up on Tuesday because I usually do it the day before the 1st. I unfortunately won't be partaking in the holiday myself. I got a lot of things to do after just moving, but at least I'm enjoying a cup of cider. But that's not the focus of the video, though. I didn't have any, spooky holiday special planned or anything like that, because today it is that time of the month where we go over our monthly tier list. I haven't missed a month aside from October since I started doing these seriously, and so I'm happy to get back right into the saddle, though I might be a bit rusty, especially because my last tier list is probably going to be a lot different from this one. We have seen a lot of subversion in the format, particularly in the form of Rescue Ace after Age of Overlord, where a lot of people just figured, a little bit extra consistency won't make it like a great deck or anything, would it? Plus, we've seen the rise and fall of a lot of other different decks in the format, because we're finally starting to adjust to a format without Castra being the dominant threat, or just the existence of a Rise Heart invalidating so many different decks. This video is a bit risky to make when I'm making it, because we do have YCS Richmond coming up next weekend, so it could actually just completely flip this over its head again, but I'm going to try to use YCS Indie statistics in order to actually base everything off of here, and some of these decks probably shouldn't be on here anymore. They're from the last tier list, and I just threw an extra couple things in here. But I don't know, I don't want to waste any more time. Let's go ahead and get right into my competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Tier list for the November 2023 format. And of course, how would we do a tier list this format without immediately starting with Rescue Ace, which I'm going to quickly put into the Tier 1 category. Now, more people are probably going to end up preparing for Rescue Ace come YCS Richmond, so it might actually see a bit of a dip, but the deck is actually not that easy to prepare for. They do have ways to play around their biggest choke point, being an imperm on your Turbulence, by going into things like SP Little Knight or playing things like Book of Moon or chaining Emergency to get it off the board, meaning that really you're just gonna have to try and rely on having an evenly matched or something to actually stop them from making such an oppressive end board. And while I do say oppressive end board, it's actually not even that insane. It's just that they just get so much resource advantage off of resolving Turbulence while also getting 2 interruptions on top of that, technically 3 if you count the quick play that revives from your graveyard, but then the follow-up they have is just crazy, plus they can play Little Knight super well. Little Knight just being an absolutely absurd card coming out of Age of Overlord. Honestly, it's doing a lot better than I expected. One of the big reasons Rescue Ace is Tier 1, though, isn't just because the end board is really strong, but it's mainly just because the sheer representation the deck ended up having. A lot of people really like the Rescue Ace playstyle and are willing to shell out the money for the Diabellstar and Wanted package to actually play the deck at its highest level, and it really showed considering the 38% top cut rep in top 32 of YCS Indie. I was genuinely shocked because I thought Rescue Ace was just going to be an alright, Tier 2, Tier 1.5-ish strategy even after Age of Overlord, but this has definitely proven me wrong. Again, we might end up seeing a bit of a shift depending on how people side for it at YCS Richmond, but I'm going to keep it in the Tier 1 category for now. Next on our list is going to be Unchained, and I will say Unchained has taken a little bit of a backseat. While Unchained is still an incredibly powerful deck, the ceiling of the game now that Little Knight and the Diabellstar stuff has released has actually risen a little bit more, meaning that Unchained isn't as powerful as it was in such a low power format. I also think a lot of Unchained players are also shifting over to Rescue Ace, similar to how Castra players ended up shifting to Unchained before a Rise Heart even got banned. So it's kind of like one of those decks that just suffers from being a really fun, good option at the time, and then eventually getting overshadowed by something else, which I assume honestly will happen to Rescue Ace as well sometime in the future. But I think Unchained is still a pretty solid deck. It can play around cards like Nib pretty easily, and they can also play around Imperm and such. Not to mention, cards like Ash aren't even really a problem right now because a lot of people are too scared to run into Thrust and Talents. It had a 6% representation in top cut of YCS Indie, and I believe that means it's I think it's 2 different tops, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's still a pretty solid amount compared to the sheer amount of Rescue Ace. Next up we have Branded, and Branded just taking a huge backseat in the format, to where I'm probably going to put it in the lower part of Tier 2. Honestly, I think Branded is a really solid deck, especially because a lot of people are dropping Ash right now due to Thrust and Talents just being so prominent that you can probably safely resolve all of your Branded stuff without a hitch, including the still really absurd Puppet Lock, because they didn't address it at all. But I think the big thing with Branded is that people are just so sick of playing it and seeing it that there's just no representation compared to other decks. People want to play a more fun, less linear deck along the lines of Unchained and Rescue Ace, and while those are a little bit linear, you're still trying to go for the same end board. Branded is just incredibly linear most of the time. I think you can absolutely snag some wins with it, especially with the Puppet Lock, because it is still completely free, but it's just not really seeing your representation to actually get tops right now consistently. And the same can exactly be said about its Chimera counterpart, which I'll lump up right there along with it. I think Chimera getting the new illusion stuff is pretty solid, but honestly, it just falls under the same category as Branded really, and that a lot of people want to play different things, and while Chimera was like the hip trendy thing at the time, it kind of just got a bit boring because it's even more linear. Next on our list is Plunder Patrol, which honestly shouldn't even really be on this list anymore. It was on here because it got like a top or two at one of the few events from the last tier list that I did in September, but honestly, Plunder Patrol just isn't really seeing any rep right now. It's one of those decks that people like want to play or mess around with a little bit while they're in like a less confirmed format. Whereas now, while there is just a sheer amount of decks in the format, you can honestly kind of get away with anything, a lot of people would still rather play a much more solid option. Next on the list is Drytron, and I think Drytron is actually in a really solid spot. It actually didn't end up getting any tops at Indy, but I think that Drytron, with the right pilot especially, can just absolutely dominate a lot of the top tables, because as I always mention, Drytron is just made up of so many different variants that all say no to your opponent playing the game or having any remote amount of fun, and with a Rise Heart just being completely gone, their worst matchup is just out of the way entirely. The main things Drytron has to look out for are the tier limit matchup due to the Ishizu cards, as well as cards like Shifter when they're going against decks like Flu, but other than that, Drytron is almost completely free to actually reign supreme, especially with Magnum up put to 1, meaning the Bestial engine is no longer as good. Next on our list is Cash, which honestly at this point should not be represented by a Rise Heart. I just haven't bothered to change it yet. I'm going to put Cash probably in the lower end of tier 2, probably above Branded because it is seeing a lot more rep than Branded right now. Cash as a deck, the main game plan it had is just completely gone, right? Like a Rise Heart Turbo is no longer the way the deck can or will play, so you kind of have to get a bit more creative with it. Things like Punk Castra I think are going to be really popular, though I'm also like convinced you can play some sort of like Horus Castra or Diabellstar Castra. You can just genuinely splash the engine in with a lot of decks, and you can use it for like a rank 7 turbo or to just get free bodies that are really large with some pretty solid removal effects as well as extra deck ripping. If anything, you can actually probably play a tier version or Monodium version of Cash as well, given the synergy with all the Visa stuff as well, so it's probably not even like that bad. You just kind of have to get, like I said, creative with it and get the right pilot to actually get the job done. Next on our list is Flu, and I'll put Flu probably just above Drytron because its matchup against Drytron is kind of favorable, funnily enough. But Flu is, as always, it's just Flu. I mean, like, it's one-card combos, it can play Shifter to shit on certain decks, and it just overall ends on really nasty stuff. Harpy's Featherstorm is still around. It can just play so many really toxic cards that there's no real reason to diss Flu right now. One thing that shocked me is just the absolute almost zero representation of Horus literally anywhere. So Tier did come back as a deck, like in a landslide appearance, but they actually opted not really to play the Horus engine at all. So for now, I'm going to put the Horus engine in Rogue. Again, Horus like as a deck isn't probably really going to be a thing, but I'm just genuinely shocked we saw like no actual representation of the Horus engine. I thought we'd actually see some experimentation, but I guess color me surprised. Next on the list is going to be Labyrinth, and Labyrinth just got a pretty nice boost out of Age of Overlord in the form of Arius the Labyrinth Butler, which on its own I didn't really think was going to do as much as something like Transaction Rollback coming out in Maze of Millennia, but after doing an entire tournament with Labyrinth using Arius, I was genuinely impressed by just how much extra interaction it provides against your opponent on their first turn. Being able, even if you're not setting like a power card like Karma Cannon or something like that, or an actual interruption, you can still get something like your Welcome Labyrinth cards to get resources for your turn, and then also if it's a big welcome, you can have that graveyard effect for the bounce on their turn or on your turn, and then the Welcome Labyrinth, if you use that one instead, can reset itself later. It sort of just gets you into the game a bit more consistently than just your furniture pieces, which I think is really nice. Not to mention that chain blocking Lady is really annoying, and so at least they kind of got you you covered there by letting you get the Arius back in response. So I think that's really, really cool. However, the deck isn't doing like anything crazy with just the Arius right now. I think we're gonna have to wait until transaction rollback to really see this deck start popping off. For now, it's going to go in the higher end of tier 2 though, because it did see at least one top at Indy. Next on our list is Mannadium, and Mannadium just got a really nice solid wave out of Age of Overlord, and it was actually one of my most embarrassing losses of the night when I was playing Labyrinth, because the new support is just so strong. Mannadium already had a lot of extension in the form of the little snow globes, and then also Rumheart being a quick effect, things like that, Vicious Astrolabe after getting nibbed. But the new cards also just had even more ways to play the deck, because you're extending, you're getting more starters, you can go into more things, instead of just going for like King Calamity Turbo or anything nasty like that. You can actually do some really solid synchro plays. And especially with like Visas Sansara, I think is like one of the really, really good ones. Like, you can just do so much off of that. I'm gonna put it in probably the lower tier of 1.5. Honestly, it's probably just around the same as Unchained. It actually got the same amount as tops. I think that once Mannadium gets perfectly solved by Mannadium players and people getting into the deck, I think it's going to be a really scary threat, even more so than it was before, because the new support is just super, super good for the deck. Next on our list is Mathmech, which really isn't seeing any like actual play either right now. Probably should be dropped from the list sometime soon unless it starts seeing some more success elsewhere. A lot of people are just tired of playing Mathmech, especially when there's just so many other better decks that you can play and get the same amount, if not more fun. Next up on our list is Purely, and Purely is also going to go up there in the 1.5 category, probably above these two, yeah. Now that I think about it, it actually got the second most tops at Indy. I'm definitely putting this in the tier 1 category. We've seen Purely like come up and then go down, and then like we've seen a bunch of different things happen to Purely, but I think it's back on the up and up, especially because it has a pretty decent matchup against a lot of the other decks right now. We've also seen a little bit of extra variation in Purely, because I think a Sprite Purely list just recently topped a WCQ, which is pretty interesting. And I mean, the deck didn't really receive any hits on the list or anything like that. I don't think they got anything interesting out of Age of Overlord though, other than like Little Knight and stuff like that, just other good stuff. But I think the deck is still really solid, and probably will be for a good while, until we eventually get, I don't know, maybe get Imperial Order back. Next on our list is Dragon Link, and I think Dragon Link is still a pretty solid deck. I mean, it's still topping here and there, and even with Magnemut to 1 and Chaos Space to 1, which I really don't think were necessary, maybe Magnemut, I don't know. The deck is just performing absolutely fine. I mean, it does lose a little bit of consistency there and disruption in the form of the Magnemut, but you're still doing the exact same thing you were doing before. Personally, I don't think consistency hits are like the most insane thing you can do. I think endboard hits are just significantly more impactful, but I am kind of glad in that regard, because I don't think Dragon Link deserved to be punished over winning Worlds, because you think, oh, it's World Championship, right? But it's a completely different format. But I think Dragon Link players can rejoice in knowing that their deck is still a really solid option for the long term, until we eventually get something really nasty hit to the deck. For our final tier 1 deck, we're going to have Tearlaments, and I'm sorry for that little bit of lag there. I don't know why Tiermaker is doing that lately. But I'm going to put Tier as our final deck in the tier 1 category. Thank God it's not a tier 0 format or anything anymore, and I do think Tier is still a really annoying deck even with all of its hits. But with our Rise Heart gone, Tier players are just coming back in droves to showcase that the deck still isn't dead, even with such significant hits to it. Because there's just so many cards that just say mill your deck, mill your deck, mill your deck, to the point where average Tier endboards have like 8 cards or less left in deck, because they're just playing gambling at that point. But to be fair, is it really that much gambling if you're still gonna get a massive payout after losing just so much money? There's a bunch of different variants you can play, from like Shaddoll to more Visas good stuff. I'm pretty sure Cash, like I said, is still running around with it. There's just a lot of stuff you can really do with Tier, honestly, and it does kind of annoy me. Like I said, I don't really like Tier as a deck. It did get really, really old, but hey, at least we're not in a tier 0 format anymore. Next on the list is Trap Tricks, which I'm going to put towards the higher end of Rogue here. Trap Tricks hasn't really been doing anything too crazy. I still think it's a fairly solid deck, and with cards like Nib, honestly, in my opinion, seeing a little bit more play, you can actually play around it really nicely with this deck, but it just doesn't really do enough, and going second is just absolutely abysmal, especially with cards like Little Knight in the format now. Next up is Sprite, and Sprite has taken a really decent back seat despite literally minimal hits over its entire lifespan. I mean, Elf obviously was a really big one, but even after that, it was still a really strong deck. And then like started a 1, yeah, but like at this point, Sprite engines are just getting smaller and smaller, to where a lot of Sprite players, oh no, starter went to 2, right? But people are just playing 1 now anyway. I think sprite variants are really solid. I mean, you can definitely see a lot of success because there's just so many different sprite variants people have to try and prepare for. Between Live Twin, Runic, I know Tri-Brigade sprite is still running around, yada yada, even Purely sprite like I mentioned earlier. There's a lot of different ways to play the deck, and while the end boards are never like super oppressive, except for like maybe the Runic version, the consistency they have is usually just absolutely off the charts, and they can afford to play a bunch of hand traps, which isn't amazing in a Thrust Talents format, but when you overwhelm them with enough, those cards don't even really matter in the end. Sorry, this is going in the 1.5 category. Next on our list is Marincess, and I think Marincess is still fairly solid, but a bunch of hand traps, like I said, in a Thrust Talents format isn't amazing, and yeah, like I said, you can overwhelm them to a point, but Marincess isn't ending on much other than those hand traps and like a Spell and Trap Negate, plus an Omni on like a really good day. But when it comes to the sprite builds, they're ending on like all those hand traps, plus like 2 or 3 Runic cards, plus whatever they have on board, like the Live Twin stuff to pop and draw even more cards. Like, there's just so much more that Sprite does compared to Marincess that there's very little reason to play it over Sprite or something else similar. Next on our list is Plant or Rika, Sun Avalon, whatever you want to call it. I think that Plant Link is just doing alright right now. I'll put it below Drytron, honestly. Like, it's definitely seen at least one top at Indy, and I think that it can see more tops in the future, but as I keep mentioning in my tier list, a lot of people look at Plant Link and they're like, oh, that deck's so cool and so good, I'm gonna hop on it. They play like a couple tournaments with it and then realize, oh wait, this deck is actually not great, and then they hop off of it. But it's not that the deck isn't great, it's that it's just a really complicated deck for a lot of people to play. It is a really difficult deck to master, so I really have to give it to people like Jess that are able to really pilot the deck to its extremes. And even when you can do that, there are times where the deck just can't really do enough. We are getting the new Aroma support though coming out of, I believe, Phantom Nightmare, so that could end up turning the tide for Plant Link as a deck. I think at least 1 or 2 of those cards are really solid, but for now it's probably going to stick in the tier 2 category. Also, just to clean things up a little bit, I'm actually going to move the branded builds down to the Rogue category because they didn't even see a top at Indy. It might change a bit in the future, but it's mainly just to keep things nice and clean. Next up on our list is Vanquish Soul, and Vanquish Soul did just get the new support out of Age of Overlord, being Zhao Long, as well as the new trap, which is something involving like frost or something like that. I don't remember. I think it's like a contrast to Zhao Long being a fire. But the deck is actually pretty decent now compared to what it was. I mean, it was already okay. It was like the best deck at one time. But it still doesn't really do enough. It's a lot more consistent now, and it actually has an additional end piece other than just the Double Book of Moon. But even then, it's a really complicated deck to master, similar to Plant Link, but it's just a different game plan. You have to really use your resources well, and again, like Plant Link, even then, the deck sometimes just can't do enough, or you end up losing to yourself. So I'm going to put it in tier 2. I'll actually put it above Plant Link because I think it's a bit easier than Plant Link as a deck. And I think it's genuinely really solid, especially after getting Zhao Long. But unless we get like a really nice card or 2 extra for the deck, I don't think it's going to be doing anything like insane anytime soon. But I'm really hoping I can be proven wrong because I really like this archetype, and I do want to play it IRL at some point once the prices are like really nice. Next up on our list, this does show just Dia Bellstar here, but this is supposed to be representing Snake Eyes, back when Dia Bellstar was literally just Snake Eyes until we got Goblins and stuff now, which are going to be really exciting to cover. I can't wait to see how Goblins end up doing. But on the topic of Snake Eyes, it's not really doing anything. I don't think it's seen a top. Like, let me know. By the way, actually, link me in the comments below, or like point me in the direction. Don't link because that'll just get blocked out. Tell me if Snake Eyes has gotten any regional tops or anything like that, because I have not seen a thing. I think for sure when we get the new one coming out of Phantom Nightmare, it'll probably be a lot better because it actually adds more consistency to the deck and extension. But the deck is like a lot like Sprite, just without any like generic endboard pieces that are good for it, because the Sprite pool, it had things like Toad and stuff like that, like really good rank 2s, but when it comes to Snake Eyes, your best rank 1 you're making is Ensemble Robin, and that's about it. I mean, like, and it's not like you get the good floating effect either. Like with Toad, you could float into your like Nimble Beaver and then get it for the next turn for follow-up. For Ensemble Robin, you're not playing any Lureless to bounce back or anything like that. So unless you're playing the jank build that my friend is playing, like with the Volzar stuff, which I think is pretty neat, it's really not doing anything nuts. Honestly, I think you're better off playing Snake Eyes as an engine in a deck like Infernoid or Volcanic, But other than that, like right now, it's just not doing anything amazing. We'll have to see after Phantom Nightmare though once it gets that new card. That new card is nuts. And finally on our list, we have Exo Sister, and Exo Sister did get a top at Indy. But I, again, really, as I always say, don't think this deck is anything too crazy. Personally, I'm genuinely shocked people are brave enough to play it right now in such a diverse format. And while it did see a top, it's such a risky deck to play if your opponent isn't playing something graveyard related, because then you're relying on just praying your rank 4s and your banishes do enough, which a lot of the time they end up just not. But I will not downplay its top. I'm sure whoever played it at Indy absolutely played their ass off, so props to them. But personally, I'd just pick something else right now, unless you really are committed to this deck and are a dedicated pilot. Well, folks, that's going to do it for my tier list for November 2023. Again, I'm a bit rusty. It has been a little over a month, but let me know what you think down in the comments below. Most of this was based off the chart from YCS Indy that I actually looked at on mcole40's channel, so be sure to check that out if you want to see the exact stats. And y'all, this is just such a crazy format. Like, we've been getting more and more diverse formats over the last couple of formats, because we're not really getting too many hits to the old decks other than like the very top deck at the time, maybe the top 2. But we're just getting so many new, really strong decks or new support pieces for already decent decks that we're just getting more and more different decks in the pool. Like, as long as it's something competent, like Bird Up, for example. I've been doing really good with Bird Up lately. I'm certain you can just take any deck that's competent remotely to a tournament and at least see some form of success or a bubble or something like that, unless your opponent has one of the auto win cards that defines this format right now, or they just play better than you. I don't know, it's both a mixture of really, really fun because you can just play anything, you don't have to like confine to whatever the restraints of the meta are, but again, it's like a bunch of auto win cards right now, so that haven't been addressed. Plus, when it's so much diversity, it's just really, really hard to prepare. Like, right now, personally, my side deck for Labyrinth, it's not even cards for matchups, it's side cards to prepare for other side cards, like Anti-Spell and Judgment for Duster and Evenly and stuff like that, and then like Lava Golem as just a generic end piece thing, or a stopping of end pieces. Like, a lot of it is just really, really generic stuff. There's no, like, spicy text or anything really to play right now. But I don't know, that's just my opinion. Let me know yours down in the comments below, because that's going to do it for the video, and the first video in the new house, first actual video. Let me know what you think about the lighting, by the way. I'm actually really digging this lighting. It's very flattering. But if you liked it, please sure to leave a like, as I'll split this video and the channel into recommended. And if it's content and you want to like it, like the rest of my tier list, then perhaps consider subscribing and turning notifications on, because we're going to 5,000 subscribers by the end of 2023, not to mention supports the channel more than anything else, and it's absolutely free. Plus, we're reaching that milestone really, really fast. Also, want to support me directly while getting some awesome TCG merchandise in the process, check out Tapioca's in the link down below. Use code Aurora5 for 5% off your purchase at checkout and to support me financially. Once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. This is Aurora, signing off.